Hey folks, today's episode is brought to you by Mariner Books, publisher of Land of Big Numbers, the debut story collection from Deping Chen. Land of Big Numbers traces the journeys of the diverse and legion Chinese people, their history, their government, and how all of that has tumbled messily, violently, but still beautifully into the present. Pulitzer Prize winner Jennifer Egan calls it, quote, gripping and illuminating. Land of Big Numbers offers intimate glimpses of the seductive power of state control, the Faustian bargaining it requires of its citizens, the landscapes and lives it forces them to discard in exchange for material prosperity. At the heart of Deping Chen's remarkable debut lies a question all too relevant in 21st century America. What is freedom? Land of Big Numbers, the debut story collection by Deping Chen. Available now from Mariner Books. Hey everybody. Hey, how's it going? Welcome to the Otherppl Show. My name's Brad Listi. It's good to be with you. I'm in Los Angeles. Happy New Year. Happy 2021. I hope you're doing okay. I hope you had a good holiday. I have a great episode for you today. Great way to start off the new year. George Saunders is back on the program for a second time. He is celebrating the publication of a new book called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a masterclass on writing, reading, and life. It is available now from Random House. And this is nonfiction. A Swim in a Pond in the Rain is a book about writing. It's a book about reading. It's about what makes great stories work and what they have to teach us. So if you happen to be out there and you're thinking of trying to write a book this year or just trying to write a story, this is a great episode for you. If you are simply a devoted reader and you've found yourself wondering at turns over the years why certain stories grab you more than others, this is a great episode for you. This is an excellent and very fascinating conversation with one of the masters of the form. Today's episode is made possible by Northwestern University Press and its new release, Art is Everything, by Ixta Maya Murray. In her funny and propulsive new novel, Murray offers us a portrait of a Chicana artist as a woman on the margins, written as a series of Instagram essays, Snapchat freakouts, and rejected Yelp reviews that merge confession with art criticism. Art is Everything shows us the painful but joyous development of an artist whose world implodes just as she has a breakthrough. Best of all, listeners of this program receive a 20% discount on Art is Everything by Ixta Maya Murray, or any other title from Northwestern University Press. Just use the promo code PPL20. Again, that's PPL20. And this offer is available at nupress.northwestern.edu. Again, that's nupress.northwestern.edu. So, having said that, let's get to today's guest without any further delay. He is George Saunders, and his new book is called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, the subtitle of which is In Which 4 Russians Give a Masterclass on Writing, Reading, and Life. Let me just explain briefly what that means. Throughout the course of A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, George Saunders includes stories by Russian masters like Tolstoy, Chekhov, etc., to illuminate his lessons and to offer a demonstration of what it can look like when storytelling is done at a very high level. So I am just thrilled to get to share this conversation with you now. Here he is, folks. This is George Saunders.
You know, I'm fortunate because I didn't have to work outside the house, so I taught from home and on Zoom and had a great class. And so it feels kind of like, in some ways, a kind of surface acceptance of it, and then a sadness kind of growing week by week underneath, because like I haven't seen my parents in a year, haven't seen one of our daughters in almost a year. So I think just like everybody else, I'm trying to keep it under control by having good habits, you know, and just I don't know. It's a real slow sadness that I'm trying to fight off. And so for me, the way I have always fought off sadness is by working. Like if I can get a big task in front of me, it just makes me happy. And I've kind of gotten to the point where I stopped worrying about why. Like the other day, we had a big 3-foot snow here, and we hadn't hired a plow guy yet. So I just thought, okay, I'm gonna dig a footpath out to the road, and it's like 300 yards, so it's an insane thing for a 62-year-old to do. But it was so fun, just to have this kind of big job. So that's kind of how I'm, I guess, dysfunctionally managing, is just working really hard.
I hear you. Like, I kind of have gotten a little bit self-conscious about, I mean, I've always been a creature of habit. I think a lot of writers are, but I've gotten to the point where, like, my routines have become like kind of the extreme version of themselves during COVID. But I don't know how better to deal with the situation than to, like you said, have good habits and just stick to them, cling to them,
Yeah, it's kind of an exaggerated version of always. I mean, there's always shit about to go down, and there's always unthinkable things happening. And so I guess I think what's happening with me is I'm kind of getting to know myself a little better, and just like, well, all right, I'm 62 years old, been kind of neurotic, and always been buoyed up by work energy and accomplishment energy. So it's kind of late in the game to wish for a different preset, So I'm just trying to succumb to it, and and the thing is, when I work hard and stay almost stupidly busy, I'm a nicer person. I'm more present. I'm a little more buoyant. So that's kind of what I've been doing, and then trying to just notice, trying to figure out what's going on in terms of the change in our national mood and all that stuff. And so far, haven't been very successful, but ready for it to be over. And also, so kind of like, I have a feeling it'll be many, many years before we sort through this and figure out who to thank and who to blame and all that kind of stuff. But that was, this Russian book was kind of a way to really, how when someone's in labor or a woman's in labor, they say have a focal point. For me, this book was a really nice focal point because it's not topical. I mean, it's like the opposite of topical. And just to go into my writing room every day and go, okay, look, everything is so confusing, but you can try to understand a Chekhov story. And by doing that, you're kind of, I felt like I was kind of reminding myself that the mind is knowable. You can know things, you can figure shit out, you can sort of celebrate a complex work of art, and the adjustment that process causes in one's mental state is actually 100% positive, and whatever else is going to happen in the world, it sends you out there, sort of invigorated.
Yeah, I feel like this is a very generous book, and I think I can imagine working on this amid all that we've been going through and finding comfort in it, and just like having it be like a kind of refuge. But I just, as a reader and a fan of your work, I was like, yeah, this is going to be a book that a lot of people are going to be excited about, because I think a lot of people who write or aspire to write want you to teach them how to write a story. Like, that's an appealing idea.
Yeah.
And this book is robust. I mean, this is a 400-page creative writing lesson with you, and you really get into the weeds dissecting these stories, and there's nothing skimpy about it, in the best possible way. So that was a thought that I had. Like, this is a generous thing to do, and like I can imagine like a mentally healthy thing to do amid all that we've been enduring. And then another persistent thought that I had as I read was, I was thinking about your training as an engineer. And I can't remember, we talked a long time ago on this show, about 600 episodes ago, so it's been a while, but I can't remember how much we got into your background, like your work history as an engineer. I think we touched on it a little bit, but I could not help but consider that as I watched you like diagram stories or out, like break them down in outline, kind of take them apart and put them back together again. It just occurred to me that in your work as a teacher and your work as a writer, you are well served by your training as an engineer in a way that might not have been readily apparent back at the dawn of your writing career.
Yeah, I'd say I'm served by it, whether it's well served or not. I have, it's just the way I think. It's something about being a little analytical, And but I think in some ways it's true to the form, because if you are on page 6 and you're feeling something, it's not unrelated to those previous 6 pages. It's all, the whole thing really, a story really is a setup. It's a setup and a delivery, just like a joke. So there's some value, I think, in that. But the other thing I've learned over the years of teaching is this is another scientific principle. You always have to know the limits of your study. So you set up an experiment, but part of the integrity of the experiment is to know where the biases are and what the limits are. So for me, I've been reminded my approach, this kind of analytical approach, doesn't work for everybody. And so there's always students who just don't like it. It's too linear, and they are working from a totally different energy. So in this book, one of the things that happened that was kind of interesting, when you're writing a nonfiction, the first draft is always a little full of it, and then you work through that and you find a deeper truth. So in this book, what I found was what I really believe in as a teacher are a handful of things that aren't really like show don't tell or whatever, but they're more like I guess aspirations for a person's mind state as he's working. So, for example, I found that for me, I should try to work in a zone about which I have a really strong opinion. So for me, it's a certain sound of a sentence I really like or don't like. I have a really strong, irrational, indefensible opinion about that, and that's where I do my best work. So one of the things I try to do at Syracuse is just make sure that people are guided to do the thing about which they have strong opinions. And it might not be sentences. It might be structural. It might be political. So there are lessons behind the lessons. And I think joy, having some kind of robust fun as you're doing something is a pretty good starting place. Which it kind of runs counter to what we always hear. We always hear that it's torture. It's terrible. You're writing well when you feel like jumping off a bridge. But at least for me, it's quite the opposite.
Well, there's a great passage in your book where you talk about how little choice we have about what kind of writer we're going to turn out to be. And you quote Flannery O'Connor, who said that a writer can choose what he writes about, but he cannot choose what he is able to make live. And you also, I think, on a related note, talk about in your work as a teacher trying to help your students find what you call in a kind of tongue-in-cheek sort of way, their iconic space. And I think that all of these ideas are related, and it's worth kind of exploring a little bit, because it feels like when writers start out, this is certainly the case for me, and I know both from reading you and having talked to you years ago, that we tend to start out trying to emulate our heroes, and we tend to usually, a lot of us, myself included, can kind of stay on that path for too long, where you're trying to be F. Scott Fitzgerald or Hemingway or whoever it is, Raymond Carver. We're kind of trying on other people's clothes, and eventually we have to get to the place where we are ourselves on the page. So can you speak to that a little bit, this idea of not having control of what kind of writer will turn out to be?
Yeah, for me, that was the big turning point in my life, was to go from that state that you so beautifully described just now and the state I've been in since. And it's something like, and it's kind of lovely, because really what you're saying is, I don't know who I am. I don't know what charms I have. I don't know in what way I'm good. So I'm writing to find out. And like a scientist, I'm going to write a bunch of stuff in a bunch of different modes. And then I'm going to kind of take the signal, maybe from readers or maybe from yourself, as to which of those modes has the most life in it. And that's different from the way we think of it, is that we have to decide what kind of writer we're going to be based on our heroes, and then do that. But so in some ways, it's I think it's beautifully like life, because you might at 16 or 17 think, I'm going to be this kind of person. And then you try to be, but the world doesn't respond to that kind of person. Then the next X number of years is spent trying out some different things and finding out which person the world responds to. And that's another way of saying which person is in most lively contact with the world, So there's a bittersweet moment there where you go, oh God, people are liking this new piece. It's not what I had in mind at all. It might even be somewhat, not offensive exactly, but somewhat disappointing to the writer of it. But that, to me, is the real crossroads. When you get to that point, you have to take the path that brings out the most lively writer in you. This, no matter what plans you had.
You know, what it makes me think of too is this moment that you describe in your own life and career where you were on a conference call at your old day job and you were bored. I think you were bored, and you were writing these, what you would describe as sort of dark Dr. Seussian, like kind of jokey, like darkly funny poems, you know, in that kind of child nursery rhyme mode. And it was kind of a toss-off, like you were just doing it to amuse yourself in a moment of boredom at your corporate day job. And then your wife happened to see them, and you caught her reading them, and she was laughing. And you experienced an epiphany. And, you know, that's worth, I think, talking about as well. Like, what was the moment of insight there?
Well, I think it was, as you said, they were offhanded. I didn't have any investment in them. I didn't have that. You know, there's always that little voice in your mind that's comparing you to your heroes, like say F. Scott Fitzgerald, as you mentioned. That's tough. You know, I mean, to say I'm going to write the sentence and compare it with the Great Gatsby, that's a real buzzkill. But it also implies something weird about the method of construction, which is you're going to, you know, like go into your brain and manufacture a Fitzgerald-like sentence to describe your current life in Spokane, Washington as a barista. And then, that's so artificial and contrived, you know, whereas at that conference call, I was just farting around. It was just, I guess I would say I had no shaping impulse. It was just sort of, I don't know, I overuse the word joyful, but it was kind of a joyful impulse, the same kind of thing you do after a couple beers at a party when you're trying to make somebody laugh. Just, it's almost like from some storage place in your mind to your mouth in a good way, without any mediation of shape. You know, oh, this doesn't sound like Fitzgerald. This does. It was just kind of a blurt. And that, I think, is still my goal, you know, to get something. And you know, I talk about this in the book, but it kind of supposes that there's something really smart going on in us beneath the conscious level, you know, beneath the mediating level. And that actually part of what we're doing when we're developing craft, so-called, is we're facilitating that thing. We're making it easier for that thing to come out of the cave. So in that moment, I really was just playing around, and I was accessing, and this might be worth noting, I was using a bunch of muscles I didn't use when I was quote unquote writing. So when I was writing, I kind of, my guy was Hemingway at that time, or maybe Joyce a little bit. I would sort of become a little more, you know, classical in a pejorative way than I normally would be. My diction would sort of try to sit up straight. I'd eliminate any trace of working class diction or humor. And so the prose had very little to do with my actual experience. In this other mode, I just was, you know, almost like trying to get the needle to budge, you know, the needle in the listener to budge. And I kind of knew how to do that from years of being, you know, trying to be funny and trying to be affable and so on. So it's really interesting. And I think with this book, I realized how much, you know, if we can figure something out for ourselves as writers, we really are figuring out something as people. It's the same, you know, it's the same. Any task that we do will lead us to certain insights about the mind and our relation to output. And I think that's totally, you know, it goes very smoothly over into real life, I think.
Yeah, there were a lot of moments in your book where I found myself sort of stopping and thinking and underlining. And one of the things, and you just kind of spoke to this, that you talked about is that you posited that we're at our most intelligent in the moment just before we start to explain or articulate something or write something down. And this is where you say great art occurs or does not. You know, it's like this flash moment. And it was one of those things where I was like, yes, but I couldn't quite fully understand why I was agreeing. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it's kind of a mysterious thing. It's kind of a mysterious thing that you're describing.
It really is. And I don't, you know, in the book, I kind of tried to tiptoe around it a bit without reducing it. But you know, I think about when I was in high school, I was a really, you know, disinterested student. But we had a teacher her name then was Sherry Williams, and she's now Sherry Lindblom, but she was our English teacher, and she was just a wonderful teacher, loved literature, and was really irreverent about it, and could really speak to a room of kids. But also she was quite disciplined. She didn't like you talking aloud in class, but if you could say something genuinely funny that would make her laugh, you kind of got a little forgiveness token, you know. So I noticed in there for the first time that there was some relation between getting her to laugh and the spontaneity of the utterance, let's say. So if I thought of a joke at 110 and didn't say it till 112, it always bombed. And she would give you this look like, why are you wasting our time? But there was another mode where the joke would arise and be spoken before I'd even mediated it. And those always worked, mostly worked. So I think there is something about this. Now, the other thing is, when you're talking about like how to write, you always reduce it. There's no way to be properly respectful of how complicated it is. And I think all of us have, to me, it seems like what we do is we make some conscious analytical structures, and we do think about our heroes. But then on top of that, we hang the real flags, which are these spontaneous moments. So I think, we always have to be careful. There just isn't a method. There are a bunch of methods, and the talking about them, it's always kind of, I think of it a little bit as a victory dance in the end zone. Like if you write a beautiful story, you can just shut up, really. You don't have to explain it. But there's something fun about it, the moment after where you discuss it and analyze it. And for me, one of the things I've had to keep open in my teaching life is the acknowledgement that I don't really know what's useful to my students. I used to think I did, Now it's really, I don't think you can know that. And I think what you're trying to do is sort of, in a class like this Russian class that I used to teach, you're trying to create a vibe where everybody, whatever obstructions each of those 25 writers is experiencing, the conversation puts a little light on that, or maybe nudges them out of it a little bit, or maybe nudges them deeper into it. But it's very tricky because certainly isn't standing up there and speaking truth. It's more about creating a vibe in which people light up. And that's really, who knows how to do that? That's really hard.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can anticipate somebody sitting at home who's trying to write their first story collection, and they're thinking about how to find this quote unquote iconic space where they are fully themselves on the page, and they've really found like the elusive voice that we're all trying to find, our own voice. Like, can you drill down a little bit more? I mean, it sounds like what you're doing is in your classes is you're trying to kind of present a menu of options to a degree to students and to help them find what works best for them. But you're all, in addition to that, you're encouraging people to really look inward and honor their own identities. You talked about trying to scrub your own work of any kind of blue collar vernacular or sensibility. I mean, this is the idea. We have to find a way to be ourselves on the page. And it sounds sort of simple, but in practice, it's much more difficult.
Yeah. When I was an engineering student, I don't know if this is true, but we were told that when they're making those highway tunnels out in the west through mountain, you come at it from two ends. Like you have two different crews working, and then theoretically they meet in the middle of the mountain and finish the tunnel. So in teaching, there's kind of two things. In workshop classes at Syracuse, which is just 6 people, and we're reading student work, in that mode, all I'm doing really is line editing, just close line edits. And then also that will lead to talking about structure, sometimes. But really, I mean, very kind of in the same tone as this book, like how does A cause B? Is it better if B causes A? That's the most personal stuff. And I find that with line edits, you can uncover somebody's voice or help them uncover their voice through line edits in a way that no amount of conceptual talk will let them do. So that moment when through cuts, somebody goes, "Ooh, that sounds like me." That's a really big moment. The other part of the tunnel is in these kind of what we call forms classes, like this Russian class, where, kind of the starting assumption is, I don't know how this is going to help your writing. It might not. It's certainly not the case that you're going to study Chekhov and just take those tricks exactly, because that doesn't work. So in these classes, it's more like, if you were a psychotherapist doing a 20-person session, everybody's got their own issues. You might know what they are outside of class, but in the context of a class, you can't personalize it. So I think what you're trying to do is just make a really enlivened atmosphere So let's say that you're stuck on endings, as everyone is, but let's say you're particularly stuck on endings. When we get to the ending of a Chekhov story, that's going to be speaking to you particularly. And if I teach it right, it won't be me telling anybody anything, but it'll be asking the right questions and just trying to, there's a feeling I've had in those classrooms, and this is why I wrote the book, where you go into a class and you, as a teacher, you're nervous. You don't want them to think you're stupid or underprepared. Any sense of yourself as an authority figure goes away, and you're just a guy in front of a bunch of young people who are smarter than you. Then, so you're kind of planning a tap dance. You've got some jokes, and then there's a really, I would say, sacred moment where, in the thrall of the story that we're looking at, somebody in the class says something really brilliant, and the whole class goes, "Oh," and then it just sounds a little corny, but the whole class kind of becomes one organism, and we're all looking for this answer, and we're working together, and we're throwing out ideas, and there's no teacher-student division, and that is really great. And I'm 98% sure that when a class gets into that mode, everybody is benefiting. Certainly not directly. It might not be 20 years, before somebody feels the benefit, but there's something about the truth in that moment that I think really speeds up the 20 or 21 individual journeys going on.
And then I think like one of the elemental questions that I'm sure you confront in your class, and you confront in this book that would be of use to listeners, is this basic question of what makes a reader keep reading. It's the kind of question that we should ask ourselves, I think, on a daily basis, but somehow I at least for my own part, I overlook this. But what does make a reader keep reading?
Yeah, and that's one of those then questions where I'd go, correct answer would be, yeah, exactly. And the thing is, I think you can generalize. You can say there are certain things that do, I think, just almost like they talk about laws of physics. There are laws. Like I think compression always helps. Like if you ever have read somebody who says the same thing 3 times for no reason, that's taxing, and you feel a little implicit disrespect from somebody who's doing that, or like they just like the sound of their own voice too much. There are things like that. But I think the deeper level is this. Okay, as writers, we need to, and we're actually really good at this, pick up a random book in the bookstore, preferably one that's been praised, and you suspect too much. And you pick it up and you start scanning, you start reading it. That's the magic moment. Like, okay, you read the first 4 words. You read the first sentence. So where are you at that point? Are you in or out? And if you're in, you're in for certain ineffable reasons. If you're out, same thing. You're probably not entirely out, but you might be hedging towards the door already. That's a really amazing little, almost meditative experiment to just read something and see what your mind does. And so then what happens is you kind of flip the mirror around and you apply that test to your own work. And the beauty of it is, I think there really isn't, a list of answers, but there are answers for each individual person. So, for example, I used to do an exercise where I'd photocopy the first page of 5 stories in some random literary journal, take off the name of the writer and pass them out. And then I would just say, okay, we're going to read these and then rank them. And then I'd leave the room. And so the first thing was nobody ever said on what basis. These were writers, and they, as soon as they looked at it, they had an opinion. Then you come back in the room, and I asked them to tell me what their ranking was, and then we debate a little bit. And that's an amazing exercise, very simple. And you see that everybody has this crazy criteria in their head that they're constantly using. Like there was one person who said, I really hated number 3 because there's just too many plants in it. Vegetation, something about the sound of words describing vegetation really vexed him, and he couldn't stand it. So probably the quickest path to voice is to say, do a form of that exercise and just look at yourself, allowing everything, and go, oh yeah, I really hate X. I'm really drawn to Y. And I think as is so often the case in writing, you don't even have to say it really. It's the exercise itself will just reinforce your tendencies. And then the kind of, golden ticket is, I think when we pick up a book by somebody else and we're thrilled by it's partly because that person has really, again, joyfully indulged their own preferences. It doesn't even have to be justified. Like David Foster Wallace, he had that incredible kind of long-winded, virtuosic voice that he knew he had, and he indulged it with incredible discipline. And what we love about him is that's what having a style, that's what having a personality on the page is about, is, knowing at some visceral level what you do beautifully and then allowing yourself to enjoy it. Now, that all sounds pretty good. And, but, maybe it leads us to something else we could talk about. Is I've noticed that I'll get letters from people saying, or go do guest teaching, and somebody will, be really good at quoting back to me my aphorisms, and they'll say, yes, I'm a total believer, and da-da-da. And then you read some work and it isn't maybe that great, So there's also that terrifying gap between the pronouncing of beliefs and the kind of cataloging of different approaches that we swear to use, and then the fact that even at that moment, there's some X factor, and somebody can have all the right ideas and still not execute, which is kind of a drag, and it kind of runs against the spirit of a how-to, approach. But I think it's really important to say that too. It's not the person who's traveled the most or is the most articulate about writing theory or has the most advanced political view that writes the best. It's the person who writes the best. So that's both terrifying and maybe a liberation for some of us.
Yeah, that's an excellent lead into my next line of questioning, because tied to this question of what makes a reader keep reading is what makes a work of literary art resonant, and why do some writers seem to have a knack for really connecting with an audience and with a reader, while others do not? They seem to be either, they might resonate with a smaller number of people, or they might struggle to get published at all. But what I've thought about this a lot in the course of doing this show for the past decade and in struggling with my own work is, I feel like the facility with language, the ability to put words on a page in a decently artful way, might be the easiest part. And the real gift is being able to read one's own work objectively, combined with, and this is just me theorizing, so you can feel free to disagree, but combined with what I call this intuition for how to please a crowd, this kind of innate sense of an audience and what is pleasing, and connected to that, and then I'm going to throw it back to you, is something you allude to in your book, which I definitely connect with as a writer and a person who does a conversational podcast, but is the idea of writing as a conversation. As a writer, you are in conversation with your reader, and when a conversation is going well, or when a piece of literature is connecting, it has something to do with presence. The presence of the author in the work that they're doing as they're, building their story on the page, or in the context of a podcast conversation. I always tell people that this project of mine, whatever it amounts to, is at its core, over and over again, like an exercise in trying to be awake, in conversation with people. And when I am, when I am to a high degree, it tends to go well. And when I fail, that's when the episodes fall short, for me and probably for the listener. So, I know that's a lot, but I feel like it's all of a piece. And the core of it is this idea of what is at the heart of a piece of writing that connects, and what it requires of a writer to create one.
Yeah, I think you said it brilliantly, Brad. And I think that is this idea of conversation, and you said, of being aware of where an audience is. And I think, sometimes in the MFA world, that's kind of, I don't know, I've gotten the sense that people don't want to talk about that. It's a little shameful, the idea that you're pandering to an audience. But I think it's actually communication. You're communicating with people for whom you have palpable respect. That's who wouldn't want to be involved in that. So I think you're exactly right. And I think I also talk a little bit at Syracuse about the fact that so what makes a conversation? Mostly, I think, honesty. What's honesty? Honesty is the absence of a distracting agenda. So we sit down here together and we're talking. And if I have a list of things I want to say, that's a bad conversation because I'm going to not be responding directly to you, and vice versa. So if there's honesty in a conversation or in a work of art, it's felt on the other end as respect. And one of the things I talk to my students about too is that it's okay, whatever's occurring in the mind of the writer is totally valid. You have to accept it. So, for example, ego. Like I got into writing because I wanted attention for something I did well, and over the years I'd say it's shifted to where I really just want to do something well, but the attention is still part of it. So I tell my students, let's not turn away from anything that might be used as fuel. So if you've always wanted to be loved and famous, fine. If you've always wanted to have a golden bust of yourself in Stockholm, fine. It really doesn't matter. It takes so much energy to write well that you have to take whatever fuel you can get. So I think that about this, that audience, that's the gateway. If you say, yes, I do want to be in touch with my intelligent audience in a respectful way, that in a way that's the answer to all your problems, because that combined with this ability to read your own work means if you're on page 6 and you're sucking a little bit, first you can admit it, and then you can say, well, I don't want to suck because that impedes my communication with the audience. What's the nature of my sucking? And most of us are good enough readers that we can figure that out. So you always have a way to go forward.
And there's a line, I don't mean to keep regurgitating lines from your book, but they just seem like such great starting points for conversation, is this idea of liking the person that you are in your stories better than you like the real me. I relate to that as well. We get to be, especially, I guess it doesn't matter if you're working in an autofiction mode or if you're working in something that, the line between you and the character is a little bit more circuitous. We still get to be versions of ourselves on the page, and we have I think the luxury of perfecting it. And I don't know, I feel very much the same way. Like in real life, I feel like I'm constantly disappointing myself somehow or disappointing other people, and the control we have on the page allows us to be the best versions of ourselves.
Yeah, and I think there's also a technical aspect to that. I was working on a story this last month or so, 2 months, and it was all right, and I was pretty happy with it. I was almost ready to send it. And then I just, in this spirit of micro-noticing, I was reading it the other day, and I got to one place where my enjoyment just went from 8.2 to a 6.8. 20 years ago, I wouldn't even have noticed, but I noticed it. And I thought, okay, so let's think about that. And then I ended up cutting out that part where the energy drop was, and setting it aside. But I really liked it. But it didn't logically belong there. It was solving a problem too soon, basically. So I just let it sit there for a few days. And then yesterday, or maybe the day before, I thought, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's the very ending of the story. And I just, kind of popped that in there. And what actually had happened was in that rearrangement, I posed a higher level question. The story is now posing a higher level question than it was before. So that's what I mean when I say I like that guy better. The guy that I was today, whenever I added that, was smarter than the previous guy because he was recognizing the lineaments of his own argument and wasn't answering the question prematurely. And by answering it later, he actually elevated it. So it's not only. I think I'm funnier with a little bit of time, because it's just infinite retakes. But the internal logic of a story, if you wait it out, if you're really patient with it, we talked about engineering. A good story really is kind of an equation, or it's kind of like a proof, I guess, a mathematical proof. Those things, mathematical proofs or coding, I imagine, they are really highly logical documents, which is to say they are very enamored of cause and effect. So by waiting out your own story, you get it to ask a deeper question, and then you get it to spit out a more honest answer, and then you feel like a smarter guy.
And you just touched on this idea of mathematical, there being a kind of mathematical logic to fiction, and maybe in particular to the story form because it's so compressed. And I'd love to hear you actually tell the story of this conversation you had with the fiction editor at the New Yorker. I think we kind of glossed over this idea earlier, but I think it's worth repeating or talking about because, as I recall it from the book, you were sort of going over some edits and fishing for a compliment.
Very much, yeah. It was that story, Sea Oak, and I worked on it for a long time, and sent it in. They liked it, and then we were doing kind of somehow we got in a bind where we were editing it a little more quickly than I would have liked, and so there was a lot of reservations being expressed. And so at one point, it is Bill Buford, and I said, Bill, what do you like about this story? And he's a really sweet, incredibly smart guy who also has a gift I don't, which is he can talk slowly and kind of, with some self-control. So he said, I said, what do you like about the story? He said, well, I read a line and I like it enough to read the next. And that was it. That was the whole aesthetic, And yeah, so it's a beautiful idea because really that's how you go through it. You pick up a book, you read a line, do you like it enough to go on? Go on. And if you keep doing that, my idea goes, all the stuff that we obsess about, theme and character and plot and political content, that stuff is going to occur naturally. It's a byproduct of keeping the reader reading. It's not the goal, it's a byproduct. So now whether that's objectively true or not, it really helps me to think that way. Just to think, yeah, don't worry about that. Just make sure that your perfect reader out there who you like very much and who's very smart, who's a little smarter than you, is still interested in your story. If you do that, everything will take care of itself. Again, whether that's true or not, I don't really care. I preach this idea of self-gaming, which is, in terms of writing, believe in that which helps you be productive. So it's maybe a form of ritual thinking. But for me to say, I really don't have to worry about any of those things that we learn about in freshman year of college, and plot and theme and character or 3-act structure or any of that stuff. I don't have to even think about it. I just have to keep, putting one foot in front of the other and looking back to see if you're still with me. And that will involve everything.
Yeah, no, it's like tied to this, like another idea in the book that you have, this idea of like the question of, does this delight me? And you were describing, I think, a stage earlier in your career when you were trying to wrestle with the expectations that you, I think, placed on yourself, because you were an ambitious guy who wanted to write good fiction, but also the expectations placed on a writer by a discerning reader. And it can become overwhelming. Like, you can give yourself a task that by virtue of the way that I think we describe it to ourselves can easily become suffocating. And you, I think, solve this problem really elegantly by sort of equating the task at hand with like being a carnival barker, leading the reader into a magic black box where like neither of you are entirely sure what's going to happen. And, it's different for different folks, but like this made the problem clear to you and manageable to you. And then I think you tie it to like,
yes.
Does this delight me? Like, am I delighted by what I'm writing? Like, or am I bored? These kind of like easy, clear questions that we use as litmus tests that, sometimes we can lose sight of somehow, and we can get lost in the mire.
Yeah, I think it's the idea that I always say something's going to happen to you in my story, and I don't know what it is exactly, and I hope it's not going to be trivial. That's kind of my mantra. And what that does is it allows me to have all these mathematical ideas about the form, while at the same time realizing that that's not enough. It's not sufficient that a thing be shapely and have cause and effect. That's just like the baseline. The glory of the story is the other things that happen along the way. So to me, it's useful to just say, I want to really take the reader, who I respect, on a really wild ride that's not irrelevant to her actual experience. That's kind of the goal. And so but see, even that is sort of hard to implement. I mean, that's pretty, that would be a real writer's block inducer if you just had that on your desk. But I think that the thing is that credo is only realizable on the line level. So, I mean, like if I say, Jim got wet walking into the creek. All right, well, is that a respectful sentence? Kind of. But there's something about it that seems wasteful to me. Just it seems redundant somehow. So I would start messing with it and say, well, maybe I can just say Jim walked into the creek, and the reader would imply that he's wet. Of course, he's in a creek. Jim walked into the creek. Now, where was Jim before? Is he crossing the creek, or is he walking alongside it and veering over? That's important. It's part of respect. I'm going to try to give you this idea as quickly as possible so that it arises naturally in your mind, which is a favor to you as my reader. So, it can be so many things about what we do can be daunting. For me, it's about trying to keep things local. Yes, I want to, cause fiction to be compassion training wheels, blah, blah. But how the hell do you do that? You can't. But what you can do is you can have that intention and then take it on the line level and see how it plays out,
So I want to ask you, there are several things that you, like kind of lessons that you include in the book that feel very much like an outgrowth of the work that you've done in the classroom at Syracuse over the past couple of decades. And I'd just like to go over them briefly, if possible, because I think they could be useful to listeners. There's a trope in the book, and I'm assuming it's something that you use in your life as a teacher, called the things I couldn't help noticing cart. I don't know if you invented this specifically for the book or if you use it in teaching, but it's a useful thing, because I think, again, especially in the context of a short story where there's so much compression and really to a degree that exceeds, I think, the novel, every word matters. There's a sense of mathematical precision to the short story that, I think in a novel you don't necessarily have to stick to as much. But what is the things I couldn't help noticing cart?
Well, basically, the thought is this: if you let's do a musical example. Let's say you're sitting in a room and someone says, "Oh, listen to this," and they press play, and there's a little 4-second of something. Well, my thing is already the work of art has begun, and what's happened is that your mind, which is a total blank, has now got some stuff in it. It's got other songs in it that this guitar reminds you of. It's got some expectation that's caused by the chord changes. It's got all kinds of things that are really impossible to articulate, but they're there. And the whole artistic journey is now the musician is going to take what she just caused to rise in her mind, and she's going to respond to it. She's not going to just add to it. She's going to actually respond to that somehow. So that is a nice way to think about it, because it means at every step in our work, we've caused that cloud to appear over the head of our reader, and our job is kind of to sort of know what's in there, and again, not to articulate it necessarily, but to just feel these are the bowling pins that are up in the air. So this cart idea is just that sometimes a story will get excessive about something. So let's use a kind of dumb example. But let's say that you're reading the first page and you notice that there's a ton of alliteration around the letter L. Okay, now your first generous assumption is that that's not on accident. In other words, the writer knew she did that. It's not a blunder. Then immediately you put that observation in your cart, things I couldn't help notice, and that is what the writer has to deal with, has to work with, has to exploit, has to answer for in the rest of the story. So, and the point is not to have the cart empty. The point is to have it full and then make use of it. So this is part of the idea that a story really is just a machine that responds to itself. And the meaning of the story comes out of how it responds to itself. So that I find that kind of liberating, because, oh God, how can I find a story to how can I write a story that will be about love, or be about, or will honor all, or, sort of use all the things I know about family life. And that's a non-starter. I can't do that. But if I say, I'm just going to make a little something, maybe a page of something, and I'm going to revise it until it starts to give off some little sparks or have some jokes or something, or where, a kind of a spring gets wound, like, ooh, Hal must really be pissed off at this point. The pilot of Fargo is something that really does that beautifully. But so I'm going to make some little page that causes some kind of potential energy, and then being an artist just means knowing what that potential energy feels like and then using it. So that takes the pressure off. And then I think that also means you don't have to worry what your story is about. Your story is going to tell you what it's about at the end of this process. And in the best of all worlds, it'll be about something you didn't even know or didn't even know you were interested in. So that's what keeps me interested about it is there's no method. You might get better at it, but not intellectually. You just get better. Your body gets better at it. And it's always going to teach you things that you didn't know you needed to know if you can keep that kind of open-minded approach.
And what is ritual banality avoidance?
Oh, that's a fancy one. It's just really saying, like you come up with an image or a sentence and you just kind of, apply the banality test. Like, is that something anybody could have thought? Is that the first order description of that, that car? Is that something that, is this move in the story the move that everybody expects? Now, it doesn't, now it's kind of complicated because actually you want to do a kind of skillful use of something. Like if you feel that the next beat of the story is, whatever, Larry runs out of the church enraged, he might very well do it. But if it responds too neatly to what came before, we get the feeling of it. It's like a Hollywood movie, a bad Hollywood movie. So I always say that we're making part of the job is to make that little page of text or paragraph create some kind of expectation, some kind of like a potential energy or a charge on the plate. And then we have to take that into account, but not too neatly and not too randomly. And that's a little bit like there was a story about the Buddha that he had a student who was like a guitar player basically, and the student said, when I meditate, should I concentrate really, really hard or should I be really kind of relaxed? And the Buddha said, well, when you tune your guitar, do you tune the string? So all of these things are you're kind of like the Three Bears, you're doing it just right. But that's why the how-to approach is kind of, I don't like it because there's no, I had to, in this book, I had to tell myself over and again, you're not telling anybody how to do it. You're just kind of describing how it's been done, or actually with the Russians, we're just describing the effect they have on us and trying to posit reasons for why. But I think part of being a real artist is you have to be really respectful of the irreducibility of what we do, which is hard to do while you're talking about it. But I think that's the goal.
Well, and everybody tunes their guitar differently. Even the pros, like everybody has their, like some guitarists, I've heard they love to have their guitar slightly out of tune or, who knows. But I totally get like, trying to find some sort of equilibrium that works for us.
At the end of the day, we're really not, we didn't become writers, although it sometimes seems like it. We didn't become writers, talk about it. And we're not, the writers that we love aren't beloved to us because they have a good line or shtick. We love them because somehow or another, in whatever mysterious way, they do it, And so I think that's, for me as a teacher, that's an important thing to remember is, and I always have this thing at the end of a semester where I kind of go, phew, that was fun. And wow, now I don't have to talk about it anymore. I can just do it, and that's a relief, even though the talking about it, I think, will help me to do it.
Yeah, no, it's like a necessary evil, and I think it's been the case for me, or it can be my tendency to sometimes to get bogged down in like the analysis of the thing. I don't know, like I can sometimes, I think, overestimate perhaps how much time I need to spend on thinking about and reading about how to and why versus getting down to brass tacks and just doing the work. I think this is something I've improved on maybe later than I should have. Like I've been too slow to realize that the most important thing is to sit down and do it.
Yeah, but Yeah, but that I think all writers are like that, and it's because we love it so much. It's like if you ever had that feeling, and I remember exactly where I was when I had this feeling of just like, I want to write a book. I want 120 pages. I want some hardcovers on it. I want my name on it. I just want that so much, and that's a beautiful thing. But then it also makes that also makes you want to be a master, which means often know how to do it every time, never make a mistake. To have a method, and that is antithetical to the task, So I think that's the line you have to walk. It's not the case. I mean, there's nobody who's a great writer who hasn't done the obsessing in the analyzing. But there's probably nobody who's a great writer who only does the obsessing and the analyzing. So it's a tough job. But I really, as I get older, I'm so happy that I chose it, because it's like a really good friend who, no matter what weather you find yourself in, that friend will have something to say to you. It doesn't, even if the thing you were going through was a diminishing of your abilities as a writer, the form would have something to say to you. Or even if what you're going through was your health was bad, or you were losing someone that you loved, the activity, if you've nurtured it over your life, it will always have some comfort to give you. Sometimes it's cold comfort. But I feel so fortunate to have something so deep in my life, because it really is a gift that kind of keeps giving,
And I want to talk, this speaks to your work for sure. And, just from my perspective, maybe there are listeners out there who share this perspective. There are imaginative feats that unfold in the fiction of certain writers that feel extra impressive to me, and it might be because I think my natural tendency is more realist. It's something I'm actually working on. I'd love to do something that's more purely imaginative and the kind of fantastical at some point, if I could like unshackle myself, is the way that I would put it. And I guess I want to talk to you a little bit about this idea of psychological physics, as you put it in your book, and the way in which a writer can execute on the page having something impossible happen, and doing it effectively. This is something you're really good at, and I'd love to hear you describe how you do it.
Well, thanks, Brad. I think, the one thing we haven't talked about is the role of necessity in a piece of fiction. So I always thought that you could get away with these fantastical things in proportion to how essential they were, how necessary they were. In other words, sometimes I'll get a letter from someone who says, I really love writing crazy stories. And I always want to say, well, but is the crazy necessary? I feel like it should always be, whatever we do, whether it's realism or not, it should always be subjugated to some emotional intention. And again, it's a vague emotional intention. We don't have to know exactly what it is. But for me, my intention is I really want all my stories to speak to those moments in our lives when the scrim drops away and we're confronted with the brutality of this life that we're living in, and also the beauty. But I want my stories to be comforting in the sense that they won't be full of shit if you read them at a low moment, something like that. So that that means that I don't want anything in the story that doesn't serve that purpose. Or another way of saying it is, I don't want anything weird to happen until it's going to do that kind of emotional work. So my default is there's no weird shit allowed. I'm basically a realist at heart, but every so often you get to a place where a story's saying, if you will just let me have the talking spider, I will be more profound, Or often what it does is it just says, there's a question I have to ask here in this story, but I can't do it without the talking spider. Would you allow it? So I think for me, that's the answer, is you really just want to, because it's a little bit like, let me think for a second. So the scene in Star Wars where they go into that bar, the first Star Wars, and there's like all those crazy, drinkers. I think that one of the reasons that works, and one of the reasons we buy it, there's two reasons actually. One is because we've seen that scene in every Western. They go into the bar, they go into the saloon. So we kind of see them going toward the saloon, we go, oh yeah, I know this. Okay, it's familiar. So in that way, it's necessary in a certain way, or it's normal. Then when you go in, the trope is kind of illuminated by the cleverness of the different creatures. So I think that's where weirdness is. Well, weirdness doesn't sell any differently than the quotidian. Actually, if I say a white horse stood in the corral, that's realism. But if you give that notion to Cormac McCarthy, he's going to make that sucker come alive in 4 dimensions with the sentence that he uses. So we have this job trying to describe a white horse as we do trying to describe the talking spider. It's a sort of a sales job in a certain way. So I think I don't really make that much of a distinction, and I'm real comfortable, like in this book I'm working on now, it's going to have some stories that are very realistic and some that are really crazy. And what unites them, I hope, is that they're all trying to do this emotional work I talked about.
And there's also this idea of how, like, if something impossible happens in a story, how the story reacts to that impossibility. I think that's kind of what you're speaking to, right? I mean, there's got to be a kind of, is integrity the right word? Or I'm searching for the word, but you know what I'm saying? Like you have to respond. Like if you insert the talking spider in your story, then everything that follows, the introduction of that talking spider, has to adhere to a kind of internal logic, consistent internal logic.
Yeah, and you said earlier, you used the word in respect to your podcast, awareness or alertness or presence. I think presence. So if you can say anything in a story. There's no limits. It's just once you say it, don't pretend you didn't. If right now the ceiling collapses in this basement from which I'm talking to you, and there's a loud crash and screaming from upstairs, and neither one of us acknowledges it, that's damaging to your podcast. Whereas if I go, oh my God, Brad, the ceiling just collapsed. Hold on a second. That makes the podcast kind of cool. So I think that's the thing is there's no rules, except I think awareness is the rule of fiction. If you did something on page 1, you did it. And not only do you have to use it, but you get to use it. That's the beauty of it. Otherwise it would never be meaningful. If that wasn't the case, a story has no way to cohere and to be moving. And so I said it earlier, but the way in which the story responds to itself is how it appears to be giving off meaning. There's a Chekhov story called Lady with Pet Dog, which I didn't put in the book, but the whole thing is so simple. There's a guy who's kind of a serial polygamist. He cheats on his wife all the time. It's like a recreational thing for him. And he goes to Yalta and he meets a new girl. And so first you're like, are they going to get together? Whoops, they did. And then the question hanging over the story is, well, is he going to abandon her as he's done every other woman, or is this the one that's going to change his pattern? You kind of know the answer is the second one because it's a story. And then the question is how? Like how is this going to be different from all the other ones? And in showing us how, Chekhov is making the meaning of the story. He's basically telling us what he believes love to be, actually. We make a little machine, it responds to itself, and the way in which it responds to itself is why we think stories have political content and emotional meaning and all that kind of stuff, and philosophy.
Yeah, what it makes me think of is like the sense of admiration that I always feel whenever I read something that I feel is great, where I feel like there's such an elegance to the architecture of the thing, and it's almost always tied to this idea of simplicity and like this kind of thought of course, like why didn't I think of that? This is the most beautiful construction.
Right.
Like as you described that Chekhov story, I was like, that's a great idea. Like wow, that's a story right there. And they're always like the good ones. You can always kind of boil down into these like one-liners or a short conversation that makes it abundantly clear.
No, and that's actually something we do in classes. I mentioned in the book called The Hollywood Version, which is, a student will bring a story in, and I always want people to give me a kind of a 1 or 2 sentence summary, as I just did with that Chekhov story. Because if like I say in the book, if some weird machine landed in your yard, you wouldn't rush out with your screwdriver to start messing with it until you figured out what it was intended to do. So if we can say, oh yeah, this story is blah blah blah. Then you can start saying, well, I think I don't really know why this third chapter is in there if that's its intention. That third chapter doesn't really work with that intention. Whereas if you just start throwing down prescriptions for a story, which can sometimes happen in a workshop, it's really, not so helpful. So I think, and so really what you find out is the great stories are always one-liners. They're jokes, basically. Now, the thing about that Chekhov story is that I don't know that I could have come away with that one line first. It feels like real life. It's sort of three-dimensional, and it's about this couple, but when you look at the structure of it, it's very simple and with some beautiful, gorgeous real-life embellishments on it in every line.
So I want to talk to you about revision, which is a huge part of the process, obviously. And, you said something in the book that really struck me with respect to how revision is tied to voice. I think that at first blush, especially the writer in an early stage of his or her career might think that the voice has to kind of be there, fully formed, or, I guess after enough trial and error, after enough reading, you might finally have like the light switch flip on, and then there you go, your voice starts to pour out onto the page. But you say that we find our voice through the thousands of small decisions that we make in the revision process, which, again, is one of those thoughts where I was like, yeah, of course. And, why have I never put that to myself so clearly? But that really is it. If you talk about this mysterious process of finding one's voice, it really is embedded in revising.
Yeah, I just try to say that it's we always think that we have one tool to make voice, which is the blurt. You stand on a mountaintop and you dictate your whole book. And I think that's true. I mean, there are times when I hit that over, I'm like, oh, this is it. But the second tool we have is to chip away at what we've said. Because usually, I'm speaking just for myself, the first drafts are pretty banal. It sounds, or, if I do an interview, like an email, it's pretty much just normal talking. It's not that great. And, but chipping away at it and even editing it with the purpose of making it a little freaky can be a way to find voice. So I think both those things are in play. Most young writers, I think, it was certainly true for me, we think the first thing is true. Just let me sing at the top of my lungs, and then with maturity, you kind of see, oh, yeah, well, I can do that. And then I can make it more particularly me, by cutting away. And usually we're cutting away the auto speech, the cliches and the kind of banalities. And also, I think a lot of times you're cutting away that which is already implied, So it's almost like a kind of a Rubik's Cube where you say, well, okay, I say, like earlier, Jim walked into the creek and got wet. Would I say that most of my readers will assume the wetness from the going into the creek? Well, probably not all of them. Maybe there's some readers who would get a little jolt out of the, getting wet part. But that's where you're being yourself and you're saying, well, I don't, I'm not writing for that reader. I'm writing for more of a jolt if I omit that last phrase. That's a kind of, micro tuning that you're always doing in revision. But in the process, if we come up with Jim veered into the creek, that has arguably more voice in it than the original version. Jim walked into the creek and got all wet. So it's all kind of, as you say, it's all tied together. Also, kind of referencing back to your previous question, that simplicity of form that we feel in the great stories, I think that really comes from revision. A story at first is always like, a drunk person on a hike. You kind of keep blundering off into the weeds and like, no, this is the more interesting way. But with revision, you kind of go, you're sort of doing advanced work for the reader. Like, okay, so let me try to see what happens if Terrence actually goes to Mexico City. Okay, so you write that. And then at some point down the line, you go, yeah, that's not really that great. Or you realize that that's a misguided section. So you lop it off and you start over. After enough time, some months or years, the reader has a sense that you've gone ahead of her and you've opted in every case for the most interesting, fraught choice. And that's what we call elegance of form. A story like That Lady with Pet Dog has certain questions that it could ask that are very profound and certain questions it could ask that are banal. And in revising it, however he did it, Chekhov made sure that the story asked the most profound questions that it could.
Yeah, it's like what you're saying speaks to this idea of a story or a piece of fiction being like what you call a highly organized system, with causation that is intentional and clear. And I guess, from a mechanical standpoint, or like from the perspective of the work itself, it's trying to get your story and the system at work in the story more organized. And that's the hard work. I mean, it's like that's the work of revision. Are there tricks of the trade or things that you would tell listeners to look for as they're assessing their own work and trying to make sure that the system is organized?
No, I mean, I think you're right. Organization is that which results for the given writer with revision. I mean, that's kind of circular logic. But if you work on something in good faith for a while, and I might qualify that because it's not true when you're young. It sometimes goes the opposite. But after a certain point in your development, if you're working on something in good faith, it's going to tend to become a better organized system. Yeah, I don't know. Because organization, I guess I'm saying organization is what happens when you revise. It just does. It just gets cleaner but then, the other thing I think we have to be careful about, and I was really mindful of this writing the book, because there's something I think it's in woodworking or something called, and I'm going to mispronounce it, but I think it's called wabi-sabi, but it's a Japanese idea that the master craftsman leaves a little fuck up in there just to remind that a person made it. So when we say organized system, we say revise, and all this. Part of it is that you are, I think of it not so much as engineering, but blessing. You do something. You're writing a 30-page story that's got so many moments in it. It certainly isn't the case that you precisely know the effect of every single phrase. That's impossible. But basically, you get it done, and you can make it through without a disappointment. Then you bless it, and you're blessing a lot of stuff you don't even know. You don't even know it's in there, You might even be, for example, I've got a story now that has a little kind of a page in there that I don't know I could exactly explain why it's there. I know I couldn't. I tried. It's there for a reason, but I can't articulate what it is. That's a highly organized system. In other words, you can program in a little bit of mess. In fact, you better. If you adhere to these principles too much, you write a proof, and a proof is not a story. So easy answers, unfortunately.
No, and I think. You want it to feel like a human being wrote it, ideally, as opposed to some sort of like algorithm or something. And I want to, on a related note, I'm going to deviate a little bit because this is not explicitly said in your book, but I think I could feel some of it implicitly in the book. And having read interviews with you through the years, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think that you are a meditator and have at least a reasonable interest in Buddhism, as do I. And I want to tie this to some recent reading that I've been doing just for pleasure. I read a biography of Allen Ginsberg, and I kind of got on this kick for whatever reason where I was reading about the beats and thinking about that whole mode of writing. And when you dig into the weeds on it, I think as a young person, when I was in school in Boulder, the beats were very much in the air in that town. And, it's very alluring, this idea of first thought, best thought, just let it pour out, and then you read about Allen in terms of how he actually worked, and you read about Jack Kerouac in terms of how he actually worked. And it really, they did do some of that spontaneous writing that made its way into a published book, but most of the time they were revising just like the rest of us. And I guess I'm interested to know if that has ever appealed to you. Did you ever go through a phase where you thought about that mode of work? And, has the meditation practice that I assume, or I think you maintain, has that affected your work or helped improve it or informed it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my wife and I are Nyingma Buddhists. And I think, there's really, to me, the beats were really important to me when I was young, and I love the idea that you would just spontaneously write a book, and then I read that book that I spontaneously wrote, and if that was it, I was in trouble. So I think there's not really a contradiction though about that, because the way I see my process is, okay, it's definitely first thought, best thought on a first draft, and also on the second draft. Your thought, so-called, is just you reading the thing and seeing how you like it and tweaking it. That takes place in exactly the same mindset as the first blurt. It's just that kind of like low concept, what you call it really. You try to keep your mind a little quiet so you can see what you did, and then you respond to it in that snap. And then the only difference is you just do that 20,000 times. So you're coming to that fictive moment fresh every time, and it is a new moment every time. Your mind is different as you interact with it. And the weird thing is, over time, you would think that process would just mean you just rewrite every day for the rest of your life, the same paragraph. But somehow over time, it does, for me anyway, it settles into something where I'm like, yeah, I'll take that. I'll take that. I'll take that. Not that. So there is some kind of the thing does kind of move in a certain direction. And then I think you have to apply a little bit of, I guess it's wasabi, where you say, well, I mean, good enough. Now the difference between maybe a really good writer and someone not so good is good enough is higher. You learn to be a little more patient with pronouncing good enough. But I think this book made me really think that there's not that much of a difference between what we call meditation and what we call writing. I think meditation is more intense and focused, and it's pure in a certain way. But what are you doing? You're looking at either a moment in the world, a moment in consciousness, or you're looking at a moment of prose, and you're trying to react to it freshly, without any, as you said, with presence, without, and what that means really functionally, it just means how many, pre-decisions are you bringing to it? What kind of agenda are you bringing to it? So, we've all done that thing where you wrote something yesterday, it was great yesterday. You come back to it today, and somehow it doesn't seem to be any good, or as good. And you can point to where it's not good, and you're like, how can that can't be right? So I think part of it is to say, okay, I'm going to abandon my predisposition to like it, and just say, today I'm going to you do that. So the same, it's just about cultivating that freshness of mind that says, I don't really have an investment in it yet. I'm just going to let it tell me what it wants to be. Another corny way of saying that, I'm going to read the energy off it correctly. And I think that's, and I think that's kind of what we aspire to in the real world. You go to a party or a political rally, and you have or you go on a reporting trip, as I sometimes do, and you have all these ideas, that are kind of how we bolster ourselves up in our continual insecurity. Well, if you can get those ideas to recede and get your mind to be quiet, then you could actually receive a lot more data from the rally or the trip or the story in front of you. So I think in that way, it's very similar to a meditative approach. But, and that all sounds pretty good, but it's really difficult because the way you make your identity is with those bolstering ideas, and so, but I do see the two activities as more mutually supportive than I used to. I used to think, I should be meditating, but I'm writing. I'm such an egotistical, and now I'm like, yeah, it's the same mind. The same mind is at work. And if I can be, alert to what it's doing, it's all for the good, either in either form.
So, do you, like, as a writer, I assume you probably have some kind of ritualized writing time. I don't know. Some people are more all over the place with it. They kind of write in little pockets of time whenever they can find them. But most writers I've talked to on this show tend to have like a set time of day that they like to work. And I'm wondering, A, is this the case for you? And then B, do you have like a sitting meditation practice that you do that is somehow correlated with your writing time, or are the two things totally separate?
They're separate. I have a plan A, which is I get up and feed the dogs and take them for a walk, and I go in and work for 5 hours. That's plan A. But often that doesn't work. So I have a plan B, which is just, as you said, just whatever I can get, And the thing that those two have in common is that there's a little, it's just like maybe a split second mind adjustment. So like writing now, so it's kind of for me, it's almost like first I agree to sit down, and then I agree to pull the paper forward. And all the time I'm like, I really don't want to do this yet. But I know as soon as I start reading, that little judgment machine in my head will kick in, and I'll get drawn into the prose. So I'm pretty flexible. I like to, I like to write when I'm feeling kind of happy, kind of hopeful or kind of tickled by something. But, but often if I'm working on something and I like the first part of it, that'll have that effect anyway. So, but over the years I've gotten pretty, I can pretty much do it anywhere or anytime. And meditation is a little more, that's been all over the place in the last 10 years, from really doing it for large blocks of time to not doing it at all. So that's on a separate track. I will say, like, this point in my life, it's getting more and more interesting and kind of vital in terms of just like, at 62, you have had losses, people and pets and have died and gotten sick, and things haven't gone the way you wanted them to. And you've seen that, I've seen the sort of intransigence of my own neuroses. Like, I'm pretty much the same person I was at 18. And you feel the end is going to come. It's at a certain point, you start to go, oh yeah, for me too. That's actually true, So then there's a little bit of a frantic feeling of like, I'm really not ready. I'm not ready in terms of my fear, I guess. But more importantly, I know one thing I know is that there's a state of mind a person can get into, which we would call, loving or selfless or compassionate or something. And I've had little tastes of that over the years. And I know it's so powerful, and it's so much where we want to be. It's a state where you've got less delusions than usual, where you're out of yourself in a really good way. But the franticness comes from the fact that I'm not there yet, ever, like every so often there's just a hint that that's possible. So in my mind now, I'm like, well, are you that stupid that, you kind of know some ways to get into that state. People who have done that reliably. When are you going to start making that a priority? So that's really a little bit heavy, but that's what's on my mind these days is, I tend to live from book to book, like, and as you know, when you're writing a book, it poses a certain or a sequence of urgencies. I've got to get the idea down. I've got to refine the idea. I've got to, make it perfect. I've got to send it out. I got to see if people like it. I got to see if what the reviews say, and then you start over right at the beginning again. So it's possible to kind of, in a virtuous way, distract yourself into your grave, before you really take on the big, beast in the room. So that's kind of what's on my mind. And I'll just say I don't really know quite what the resolution of that is. It should be possible. It should be possible to do both. And I think for people like us, it probably is necessary to do both. Just to say I banish writing, I'll never do it again. I think that's probably the weaker move, but it may just be like everything else we've talked about, a matter of proportion.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about like these kind of brief moments where you're in touch with kind of a more compassionate or awake mental state or mode of being, and how fleeting those moments can be. Like I've been doing a lot of meditating. I've been doing a lot of meditating for a lot of years, but I think during the pandemic, maybe more so, just because I'm home and might as well. Seems like a good time to be sitting and getting quiet or whatever. And what I had happened to me just yesterday that illustrates this is that, like, I had a pretty good sit. They're not all the same. Sometimes I'll have a sit where it's like, ugh, that was they're usually messy, but sometimes they're extra messy. And then I went through a sit yesterday where there were some nice stretches. That's usually the best it can get. You'll have some nice stretches where you're like, wow, I was actually like concentrated, and I felt a sense of spaciousness in between, breaths or whatever, and kind of buoys you a little bit. And I finished up and I walked inside, and my kids are there, my wife's there, and she starts talking to me about something, and it had to do with like COVID protocols and friends of ours who like went to a party or something. And I just like, all of a sudden, like without even realizing it, was like, they think, what are they doing? I went into this like hypercritical mode where I was just, dissecting these behaviors, and I caught myself and I was like, wow, that was fast. Like I lost it almost immediately, and I think it's this idea of being forgetful, this constant forgetting and trying to improve the time ratio between knowing and forgetting that is like a part of the project for me. Maybe it's the part of the project for everyone.
Yeah, it's really, the mind is a really deep, it's not a linear thing. I think that's, for me, writing is it's a good way of kind of reminding ourselves that there's a kind of knowing that isn't everyday knowing, and we can access it. That's about as far as I could go with that. Like you did, we talked earlier about my feeling, and I think you agreed that you feel like a better person on the page than off. That's interesting, because you made that story or that novel, you did make it. So that opens up all kinds of doors about who, when we talk about me or you, who is that? Is it the person who blurts something out? Is it the person who works on something for 4 years? I think the truth is it's obviously both, So I think maybe, especially in this time where it seems like there's such a premium on being sure of shit, and being on a team and deriding the other team. I think it's really useful to do something that is just consistently humbling, and humbling in the real sense, not like when somebody wins an award and they say they're humbled, but humble in the sense that you fuck up all the time. And even when you think, your pride says this is a good story, it turns out it isn't, or it is a good story and it goes out in the world and nobody really likes it, or just the beautiful thing of being caught in a technical puzzle. The thing that I've come to really appreciate is that, a good day is a day on which you're reminded that, one, you're multiple selves, and two, that you're not, maybe the same thing, you're not reliably anybody, and you're not above the fray. The fray is going to get you. So art is almost like a relatively low cost way of destabilizing our vision of ourselves as being in control and perfect and permanent and even being clear-sighted. If you are a writer who revises, your clear sight it's negotiable. So that's what I like about it.
Well, the last thing I'm going to ask you about before I let you go is this idea that there are two things that separate writers who publish from those who don't. These are kind of conclusions that you've come to over the course of your teaching life, working with a lot of talented people. Can you talk about what those two things are? What separates the writers who publish from those who don't?
Well, if I can remember, it was coming from a good family. That's one. No, having a lot of money. No, I think correct me if I misremember, but I think it's just revising, learning to meaningfully revise, and then also being able to honor causality. To make A cause B. The first one we talked about a lot, and that's obvious. But the second one is maybe it's first of all, it comes out of a certain aesthetic assumption about the story, which everyone may not share. But if you talk about the classic short story, it's really just a little machine to cause stuff, and we feel it as disciplined and meaningful to the extent that the causation is discernible. That's really the truth. So, and it's kind of like Hollywood stuff. Or vaudeville. You just, you have a first scene. Does it cause something to happen? If so, does the writer recognize it and then let that thing happen? That's easy, supposedly, but it's actually I think it's the hardest thing that there is to do. And mostly, when I see student stories that aren't working, it's either that there's no causality. The whole story is just a series of riffs that the person wanted to do, or the causality is kind of cross-footed. Like A doesn't really cause B. B happens, but it just seemed to happen separately from A. So this is, maybe a little banal and a little technical, but I find myself doing a lot of talking about cause and effect. Does the first part of the story lead to the second part, when you read the second part of the story, does your mind kind of go back to the first part and go, oh yeah, so that's, again, I think good causality is also a direct result of revision, and I always feel a little bit like I'm a little too engineering-ish about this. So I don't mean to say, I really don't mean to, pronounce a manifesto or even a set of principles. I'm just observing that when one of the really reliable feelings of delight that we get when we read a story is when we feel that the non-randomness of it, or to say it another way, the writer has kind of set the table and caused certain expectations to arise, and then she exploits them, and that's really just kind of it's a beauty of the form. It might also be kind of a burden of the form, that you, if I say once upon a time, there was a boy who could fly. Well, we've just, it could have been any story when I said once upon a time. As soon as I say there was a boy who could fly, I've eliminated a bunch of stories that it can't be. And I've made his ability to fly sort of the elephant in the room. That's a mixed metaphor. But so that I think causality is really hard. And I think it's worth talking about. It feels a little bit, I don't know. I've had some times where it felt like students were resisting it because it seems so kind of babyish, causality. But again, if you look at the great stories that we love, that's almost all they are. In the book, there's a story called The Darling by Chekhov. And I do this analysis where almost every line in the story is there to serve this causation. And we don't feel it that way. That's one of its strengths, is we see it, we feel it as just sort of a beautiful anecdote. But actually, if you study it, it's a machine. It's a machine that actually doesn't. It's not a realist machine. There's no reality in the world that's ever been that pre-selected and winnowed down, and in which 3-month periods aren't narrated and so on. So
yeah, it's these elegant constructions, and
yes,
kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where the beautiful fictions tend to have like this really wonderful simplicity to them, but it takes some work maybe to arrive at that simplicity.
Yeah, you get the feeling that they kind of know what they're about, and then so it's like an elegant, almost machine-like simplicity through which somehow life, the actual stuff of life comes through. And that second part, of course, that's the hard part. It's I think, you watch TV these days, and there's an amazingly rewritten and highly causation-inflected stories. Well, there's still another factor there. Is it speaking to our actual experience, in some way that, and then even beyond that, is it speaking to our experience in a way that, and here each writer would have to fill in his or her own blank, For me, I think stories are, I don't really care that much about documenting the way things are, but I like the moment when the reader feels that I see her and that we're in the same game together. And maybe it's even a little bit aspirational, like, that moment when you read a story and it kind of jolts you awake a little bit. So it's not an observation or a documentary. It's more of an event, it's like a roller coaster. You get off the roller coaster and you understand that the purpose of that was to kind of jolt you awake for a couple of minutes. And that's it. Actually, you can start to talk about it afterward. You can describe it, but the real point of it was just that feeling that you got several times during and then as you stepped off. And I think that the highest level creative thought is just about that. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to mess somebody up in a good way, and then just sort of walk off.
Yeah, it's like a heightened alertness mixed with slight nausea. That's the effect that we're all going for.
Yeah. And you want to go on again.
Right. Well, George, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm really happy to have the chance to have you back on the show and to talk with you about this book. And I'm happy that you wrote it because it feels like a book, as I said at the top of the conversation, that I was kind of hoping you'd write, I think. I realized that as I was reading it, and I think there are going to be a lot of people who are thrilled to kind of go along for the ride and to learn from you and to learn what you've learned over the years in terms of how to go about doing this work. So I appreciate your generosity of time, and I wish you well in the rest of this pandemic, and I wish you a happy New Year. It's got to be better than last year. Fingers crossed.
You too, Brad. And let me just say too that thank you for having me on. And this, the way you run this podcast is a perfect demonstration of the stuff I'm talking about in the book, about presence and about, true communication. And I think, what seems to run you is genuine curiosity about the topic. And that's also something as writers we can think about. If we're writing something and we already know the answer, we probably shouldn't do it. But to be genuinely curious about it is, the reader feels that. And I certainly felt that today with you. So thank you very much.
Okay, guys, there you go. That is George Saunders. He is the author of 11 books, including the novel Lincoln and the Bardo, which won the 2017 Man Booker Prize, as well as several critically acclaimed story collections, including Civil War Land in Bad Decline, 10th of December, Pastoralia, and In Persuasion Nation. His latest book is called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. It's available now from Random House. You can find George Saunders online at georgesaundersbooks.com. One more time, the new one is called A Swim in a Pond in the Rain. Go get your copy immediately. The Other People podcast is offered freely. All episodes of this show are available to you for free. That's nearly 700 episodes. You can listen online via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. New episodes go live every Wednesday, and sometimes every Sunday, but every Wednesday for sure. You can support the show over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Throw a couple of bucks in the hat over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. If you want to email me, the email address for the show is letters@otherppl.com. Let me know what you think. Tell me a story. This program has its own official app, the Other People with Brad Listi app. It, too, is free. Go get the app wherever you get apps. The Other People with Brad Listi app. It's a good app. It's a great way to listen to the show. If you would like to get some Other People gear, you can do that over at the show's official website, otherppl.com. Just go to otherppl.com and click on the t-shirt in the left sidebar. Get yourself some gear, a t-shirt, a tank top, a sweatshirt, what have you. Get some Other People apparel. It is good stuff. Next up on the program, let me see what we got going on. My guest, I believe, is going to be... What do I got here? Oh yeah, Jill Adamson, a lovely Canadian author. I had a good time with her, so stay tuned.